This episode in our long series on RuneQuest and building a campaign world has been very difficult to film, partly because I've been so busy at work, but also because there are so many concepts coming or converging in this one clip that it's just been difficult to keep to any kind of manageable length. This episode deals with combat, particularly combat between a melee combatant using a hand weapon and a combatant using sorcery. The primary reason I wanted to playtest this out and present it as an example is that one of the elements of the game world will be a cult that has a mercenary arm. Now, I won't get into the motivations here, but basically it sends mercenaries out into the world trained with sword and spell. So let's talk about who's involved and how they fight. Our first combatant is a nomadic warrior trained in the use of axes who is starting this combat within a few meters of his opponent, and he'll be attacked not exactly by surprise as they are arguing, but he'll be attacked at range and will need to close the distance to use his axe. Now, he has his axe out and ready, and while he is trained in throwing axes, this is not the axe that he's holding. So one of the options I want to explore is how difficult will it be, and how well does RuneQuest model changing weapons? All right, this is something that I found in real life is quite difficult, and so I wanted to see how the system handled it. Now, the other character is the mercenary sorcerer, and he'll have the option of attacking with spell or attacking with sword, and he's attacking with spell. So the challenge for him is, if our nomadic warrior, our axeman, gets in close and starts hacking on him, how difficult will it be to switch from spell-based combat to drawing his sword and defending himself that way? So there's our situation. Two men in an argument within a few meters of each other, very easy to move in and start cleaving on each other, but one of them begins the combat by casting a spell. Combat is essentially rolling percentile dice, and this is what's called in RuneQuest a differential roll. So one combatant on their turn is attacking. They'll roll a number. This will be compared to any defensive roll that the person they're attacking makes. The difference between the two rolls will determine success or failure, and will determine the possibility for special effects. And we'll get into special effects again in more detail in another clip. Just know that they're out there. Combat in RuneQuest takes place in rounds, and rounds are subdivided into turns. And a turn is defined by everybody that can act being cycled through, being processed. Actions are determined by action points, and action points are derived from your characteristics. We've gone into that before when we talked about character creation. So the number of action points you have determines the number of times in a round that you can act. There are two basic types of action. There's proactive and obviously reactive. You can make one proactive action per turn, meaning you can attack once per turn. And the number of turns is determined by how many action points total there are involved in the round. So if there's a character with 3 action points, like our sorcerer, and a character with 2 action points, like our axeman, then one round is basically going to last a maximum of 3 turns, and only if 1 action point is spent each turn. What limits the use of action points is, as I've said, there's a limit of 1 proactive action per turn. And there's no limit on the number of reactive actions that you may choose to take. The only limit is the number of action points that you have, and every action that you take costs an action point. Starting to repeat myself. So, to be clear, our sorcerer has 3 action points, our axeman has 2, and any turn in which they go head to head, they could both choose to attack for the cost of an action point, and they could both choose to react to the other's attack for the cost of an action point. And that would finish the axeman's ability to act in that round, because his 2 action points would have been spent, and they could have been spent in 1 turn. In the sorcerer's case, however, he has 3 action points. So he could attack, he could defend himself, and then there would be a subsequent turn where he could attack again. So the advantage in terms of presence of mind in combat is starting with the sorcerer. So we'll see what happens after combat begins. If you read about combat in RuneQuest, you hear that it's lethal or you hear that it's realistic, but primarily what you hear is that it's designed to be blow by blow. Right? It's not an abstracted number of attacks or a period of time wherein fighting takes place. It's blow by blow. 1 sword swing, 1 parry. This is how RuneQuest combat is defined. And so, combats are actually realistically short. Now, it seems like if you're going to do one roll per each individual action, it might drag on forever. But you hear often that combat will last 2 or 3 rounds at most, and that's borne out by all of my playtests so far, and including this one. So, what happened? We have these 2 men, they're arguing. They're within a few meters of each other. The sorcerer, for his mysterious reasons, chooses to launch this withering ranged magical attack. The player would tick off the magic point cost, we'll get into those in another clip, and spend an action point. He's attacking in turn 1 of round 1. The axeman has the option to defend himself or not. Okay? This can be declared before or after the roll. The reason why you can roll after the roll is essentially just to keep the game moving, right? Rather than wasting time on unnecessary actions. You can trim that. You can say, roll to hit, okay, you hit, would you like to defend yourself? You don't have to do it that way, but it's an option. Okay, so he has the option to defend himself. Now, because this is a magical ranged attack, it's not something that can be parried. It can only be evaded. And evasion as a maneuver in RuneQuest is an all-out defensive maneuver where essentially you throw yourself to the dirt or try and get behind cover. So this would be the kind of thing you do if a volley of arrows were coming in, or if a large number of people were charging you. You would try to evade. It basically means that nothing else is going to happen for you that turn. Right? You're throwing yourself to the ground, and at the very least you'll need to get back up again. If a character is skilled in acrobatics, this can be replaced in terms of evade and can allow the character to keep their feet, but this was not the case in this combat. So, our axeman has the choice of manning up and pressing through the black waves of withering energy that are approaching him, or trying to evade. He does not have a very high, let's say, willpower, right? His power is low, his mental endurance is low. This freaks him out. He hits the deck. So I roll to evade. All right, so the first thing that happens is the invocation skill of the sorcerer is rolled to determine a hit or not, and then the evasion skill is rolled. And the way that it worked out was that the magical attack was a critical success, and the evasion was a complete failure. Now, the critical success in terms of sorcery is just a reduction in the magic point cost of the spell, so it didn't really amount to much, but it was kind of a thrilling way to start. The failure of the evasion, again, doesn't mean much. The character still hits the dirt, and they get hit. So I roll a hit location on a d20, and I score a hit on the right leg. I roll damage because of the skill of the sorcerer in question. I get to roll a d8 for damage according to the rules of the spell. And so I rolled a 4, removing 4 hit points from the right leg of the axeman. This is still a value above 0, so this is treated as a minor wound, and it has no other effect than pain and the role-playing effect of seeing your leg wither away. So this role-playing effect I took into consideration. I could have had the axeman try to regain his feet, right? His proactive action, getting up. I opted not to. He's on the ground, reacting, communicating with the sorcerer. Will the sorcerer show mercy? No. For in-character reasons I am unable to disclose at this juncture. The sorcerer presses the attack, firing another wave of this withering spell energy. But the situation is such that, if you remember, our axeman is on the ground. He's thrown himself down. He's prone, and this is a ranged attack. Right? The range has opened up between them. And so I apply a ranged penalty to this attack roll. The defender is prone, and so I lop 40% off the invocation skill of the sorcerer. And he fails, so he misses. Our axeman spends an action point and gets to his feet. He has spent both of his action points, and the sorcerer still has one more action point remaining. This takes us to turn 3 of round 1, where yet another wave of withering darkness blasts out at the axeman, who's now on his feet, hoping to be able to close the distance. Once again, the spell energy misses, parting around the axeman for mysterious, mystical purposes of its own, as mankind doesn't fully understand magic, sparing the axeman. Taking us to round 2. Nothing has happened to affect initiative, and so it will still be retained by the sorcerer, who, unsurprisingly, maintains his magical assault, trying to keep the axeman at bay, and really not having any reason to believe that he won't be successful at this juncture, mainly for in-character reasons. So, our axeman must change the range. He has to close to be more of a threat and not just be sitting out here being nuked by magic. So, spending an action point to close the range. That's his action for turn 1. Our spellcaster's, our sorcerer's action for turn 1 is, again, this withering bolt of darkness. They both spend 1 action point, and as the axeman closes, this wave of energy goes out successfully. I roll a location on d20, and this time get the abdomen. Now, the axeman is wearing armor through his torso. If this were a sword attack coming in, this armor has an armor value of 3, which would automatically lop off 3 points of damage from whatever the damage total was. But this spell bypasses normal armor, and so it passes through unmolested. I roll a d8 for damage for the spell, and score 5 points of damage to the abdomen. An absolutely devastating attack, still above 0, but you can imagine the axeman's mental state at this time. He's closed in, but this energy is just literally sucking the life out of him. What can he do? It's very much kill or be killed. We move into turn 2. The axeman has 1 action point remaining, and he uses it to attack, and he attacks with gusto. his axe attack will succeed. Okay. Now, our spellcaster hasn't just been sitting around waiting to be hacked up, and he's casting his spell first. But once again, he misses. Perhaps it's the shifting range, perhaps it's the condition of the environment on which they're standing, the effect of ley lines or mystical energy interfering with his ability to concentrate, or perhaps it's just the look in the eye of this axeman walking at him despite the deadly effect of the magic being projected against him. For whatever reason, his attack is unsuccessful, and the axeman walks up and tries to bury his axe in his chest. Sadly for our axeman, he's not in the most healthy condition for reasons I can't quite get into at this time. And he has a damage penalty. And so, although he generates a 5-point attack to bury this axe in the sorcerer's chest, only 3 of these points can be counted. But there's no armor to stop the attack, and so a nice, deep axe wound is cut into the sorcerer's chest, and you can imagine the the arrogant rage that would come as a result. So just like before, the sorcerer has the option to try to defend himself, and this is where we start to wonder, about the investment of points. Trading this defense versus the ability to attack back at the axeman without the axeman being able to defend. But some guy's trying to cut into your chest with an axe, and you can clearly see it's going to hit you. So, of course, what do you do? Now, in this situation, the caster has been using verbal and somatic components to cast this combat spell. So picturing short, guttural words and very quick and decisive hand gestures. So he casts the spell misses, his hands are up. The most sensible thing here is to try an unarmed parry. He's not willing to throw himself in the dirt just because of who he is. He's not the evade type. So, an unarmed parry. Unarmed skill for this character is not high enough to make it very likely that this will be terribly successful, but who's going to stand there and get an axe buried in their chest? So, action point is spent, the roll is made, the roll fails, the damage gets through. 3 points are applied to the chest. This is a minor wound, meaning that no additional combat effect other than role-playing through being cut open is required at this point.
Now, with the unarmed parry roll being a failure and the armed attack roll from the axeman being a success, this gives us the opportunity for a special effect. And I won't get into that too deeply, but one special effect is earned by this difference in the differential roll. So, we can choose from a list for this one special effect. And it could be something like capitulation, or choosing a location, or if it's a cutting or slashing weapon, you could even choose bleeding. And in the state of mind that the fighters are in, capitulation doesn't really seem to be what they're going for. They're trying to kill each other. And so I think the special effect that I would choose best in this case would be bleeding, which basically results in a check for fatigue in every subsequent round. But as we're going to see, this round is almost over.
One additional option remains. RuneQuest includes luck points, and the primary purpose of a luck point is to change your luck. This can be applied to any die roll, and it can also be applied to reduce damage. So in a case with a severe wounding, you might consider spending a luck point to reduce the effect of that wound and maybe keeping a limb. But in this kind of case, spending a luck point, you could re-roll your own defense roll to try and succeed if you have failed, or you can force your opponent to re-roll their successful attack, hoping that they will fail. At this juncture, I, as a player, don't think very highly of the chance of the axeman missing in a situation, and so I held on to the luck point. With the axeman's 2 action points having been spent, and the sorcerer's 3 action points having been spent, that ends round 2 after just 2 turns. We move into turn 1 of round 3. These 2 men are still face to face, so our axeman, he's going to attack, but still, the sorcerer has the initiative. He has the option of trying to draw his sword, but to do so opens himself up to attack. So really, other than launching an unarmed attack or trying to open the range, attacking with spells seems to be the most logical thing to do. He does so. He's successful. The attack will hit. The only defensive option open to the axeman is evasion. As we've mentioned before, he's been building up this momentum. He is going to kill or be killed. He opts not to evade. So we resolve the attack. Hit location is rolled on d20, once again striking the right leg, and this time scoring 7 points of damage. This takes the leg, which was just above the 0 marker, down to below its full value, below 0. Okay? So he had 5 hit points in the leg and has now lost 11 total since the combat began. For some kinds of attacks, like with an axe, this would result in the severing of the limb, but in this case, the magic withers the limb to the point where it's useless, and nothing beyond magical healing would be able to address that, for example. And so, the effect of taking a wound of this type, which is it's called a major wound. A wound below 0 is a serious wound. A wound below the normal value of the hit location is a major wound, and it comes with the need to make an endurance check to stay conscious. This endurance check is failed. Writhing in agony and losing consciousness to the pain, the axeman goes down. And what happens to him is a story for another day.